This is the RoR Live Series, episode number 6. Today we're talking all about understanding green coffee with the author of the new book, Green Coffee, Chris Kornman. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another installment of the RoR Live Series brought to you by Roast Magazine. Roast Magazine is one of our industry's longest-running and most respected trade journals, offering you insights, wisdom, and instruction from some of the world's best coffee minds, subject matter experts, scientists, to help you build your business, hone your craft, and develop yourself as an amazing roaster. And you can find all of that over at roastmagazine.com. You really should subscribe to Roast Magazine, and you can actually use the code ROR when you're at roastmagazine.com. Use the code ROR and get $5 off your subscription today. And not only does Roast Magazine have a magazine, but they also publish books, such as the one we are going to be talking about today with our guest, Chris Kornman. So if you're a roaster and you want to stay up to date with the latest research and trends and insights, you definitely need to subscribe to Roast Magazine. Check them out over at roastmagazine.com. Now, the RoR Live Series is our normal RoR series, except it's done live, actually. It was done at the SCA Global EXPO in Boston this past April. We took the show on the road and were able to talk to 10 amazing coffee professionals during this conference, and one of them was Chris Kornman. Now, Chris Kornman is the Director of Education at the Crown Royal Coffee Lab and Tasting Room in Oakland, California. He is a seasoned coffee quality specialist, a writer and researcher, and is the author of the new book published by Roast Magazine called Green Coffee, a guide for roasters and buyers. And today we are going to be talking with Chris about what we need to understand about green coffee. Of course, there's a lot to understand about green coffee, and in 30 minutes, barely going to scratch the surface, but I hope that really inspires you to buy the book to learn even more. But in this conversation, we hit on a lot of major themes that will help you wrap your head around the concept of green coffee, especially if you're somebody who's in charge of buying coffee for your roastery. And that's going to be a lot of you out there listening to the RoR series. Chris is somebody who I think, given his experience and expertise when he speaks, I think we all should listen. And so especially if he's written a book, we should all be reading it. So I was really excited to get to officially meet Chris, I think for the first time. We've both been in the industry for so long, it's likely we probably crossed paths somewhere far back, but it felt like meeting him for the first time during this conversation. Don't forget, you can actually watch this conversation as a video over at roastmagazine.com or at the Roast Magazine YouTube channel. So without anything else from me, let's get right to this interview. Here now is my conversation all about understanding green coffee with the author of the book, Green Coffee, Chris Kornman. Okay, Chris Kornman, welcome to Expo and this live interview. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Congrats on your new book, Green
Thank you.
Coffee. You know a thing or two about green coffee.
I hope so. I wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
I better know something.
So, you're the Director of Education for Royal Coffee. You spent 10 years with Intelligentsia and before that. And you don't get to be that experienced in the industry without just noticing a lot of things. And I know there's so much of your book that's just dedicated to giving people a leg up in understanding that I bet you wish you had when you first started.
I think that's the goal. It has to be to share, kind of democratize this a little bit. I think that I was very privileged to have excellent mentors and opportunities coming up at Intelligentsia, and having taken advantage of those opportunities, I feel like at this point in my career, it's my obligation to share what I've learned, and exactly what you said, to provide that kind of information to folks who need it. I don't think that there's a resource quite like the book that I've written out there that's compiled in both a comprehensive and accessible manner that's relevant to roasters and buyers.
Wow.
I think that a lot of what's out there has been focused on academic research, which is excellent but hard to access, or personal experience, which is difficult to translate sometimes. And I'm not going to say that I don't have either of those in the book, because both are there, but I think that they're filtered through the lens of accessibility.
I like that accessibility is the focus, because you gave two different kind of inaccessible examples of it's anecdotal and it's experience-based, and so you still have to translate it, or it's highly scientific and you still have to translate it. And in your day, if I can say that, you've been in it long enough, we could say that, right? There was not tons of people clamoring to be green buyers as there are today. I feel like there's more people trying to get into this as they see different smaller roasteries opening up and importing companies opening up. And it seems more accessible to become a green buyer now. Resources like this book feels like it's the resource that you need for an industry that's expanding access to more people to that position.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think what I've observed in the past 15 or 20 years in the industry, Intelligentsia is a monolith. They're a founding member of the third wave, you could say.
Yeah.
And at that time, I think that a lot of us felt like it wouldn't be possible to start a cool coffee company and to source directly. And so, along with others like Stumptown Counterculture and maybe you could put Blue Bottle in that mix as well, they kind of paved the way for individuals to begin starting smaller companies, and that's where we see this explosion of access to a green coffee market and to direct trade relationships. And I'm not exactly sure where I was going with this, but I think it had something to do with the fact that, there weren't that many green buyers back when I started. And now there's so many people who have so much better access to that. And, honestly, I think that for growers and exporters and producers, the access to roasters directly has made a huge impact on the way that they shape their coffee growing and processing as well.
How so?
Well, I think that you see demand for a lot of microlots of uncommon qualities, and I think that we're in the middle of what I would consider a renaissance of natural process coffees and interesting innovations, things like the anaerobics or, spiking your tank with fruit or cinnamon or whatever it is. And you can say what you will about that stuff, and I often do, but the point is that the point that I love is that it has really begun to revolutionize the way that people buy and sell coffee. It's not, I work for a trader who is very traditional and rooted in pre-third wave, coffee sales. And it's revolutionized the way that we operate our business as well within, this shifting paradigm, I guess you could say.
So revolutionizing things in the direction of what?
Well, as it pertains to trade, let's say the way that we interact with growers and buyers. Royal Coffee, while we do purchase a large amount of coffee for ourselves, we're also facilitating direct trade. And I think there used to be this idea that roasters were like cutting out the middleman or buyers were cutting out the middleman to go around importers. But the fact of the matter is you still need an import license to like move coffee from one port to another. And beyond that, it's like, I think there used to be some regret or animosity on the traders' part who were losing clients like Intelligentsia back in the day who were purchasing their own coffee. And that has also changed in the last 10 years where it's like, it's completely shifted the landscape, right? The goalposts have changed, and for traders to survive, whether they're small or large, they have to embrace this idea of direct access and new processes.
So all of this direct access, these relationships, the communication, it changes what people do with the coffee, which changes the coffee, which changes your expectation on what you're going to do with the coffee as a roaster. Then obviously that we're talking about a value stream here, right?
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning, I guess, and ask the real easy / not easy question, which is, what is fundamental to understand about green coffee?
It's a lot. It's multifaceted, and I don't think that's a surprising answer. I think that from a roaster's perspective, if you want to talk just about physical measurements, there's been a lot of focus over the years on things like moisture content and screen size, and those are important, and I think that, over the past maybe 5 or so years, maybe a little longer than that, we've seen an increased focus on water activity, which is a kind of the other side of the coin of the moisture figure. And all of these are addressed in the book, but the one that I really like to home in on for roasters is density, because it's an accessible measurement that you can do with almost no equipment. All you need is a cup and something to weigh stuff. And density, when measured accurately and consistently, gives an incredibly important picture to roasters about how that bean is going to perform in the roasting equipment itself. You can make predictions about how long your drying phase in the roaster or how long your Maillard phase should be based on nothing other than knowing a bean's density. How much heat can that bean take is directly correlated to green coffee density.
Okay, and so now where we see in the industry a larger variety of coffees coming in green coffee. We have an embracing of blends like never before. We have an embracing of, you could say, lower scoring coffees in terms of like low 80s are still being celebrated more. And a lot of times it's because the higher elevations are being decimated by disease, and there's density correlations to the kinds of coffees that we're getting. What are we getting mostly right now in terms of density that we should be aware of? That's different today than it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really relevant and good point, because I think even in the past small number of years, maybe 5 years or so, I would say an overall, and this is anecdotal, I haven't got, a trove of data to necessarily back this up today. I'd need to compile that for you.
Got to write another book.
Maybe, I guess. No one's going to read that one.
It'll be too dense.
Well played. I think that we do see an average reduction in many areas, and I think specifically of Kenya as an example of this. And I think it's related partially to, instead of, they're still growing coffee at the same elevations that they used to. It's that they've had to adapt their plant types, right? So instead of strictly SL varieties, we're also starting to see the hybrids, right? The RoR 11s from a decade or more ago, and then now Batian is the newer cultivar in Kenya. And while these coffees are exceptional at resisting disease compared to the old SLs, and they have incredibly high yields, they also, have trade-offs. And one of those trade-offs potentially is that we're seeing different density of overall green coffee than we used to in the past.
Is it true that when you say this, I'm thinking about somebody looking at a purchase sheet that you would have online and saying, oh, it's this variety. Oh, that's interesting. I'll try that. And then trying to taking that variety and saying it was from this country, I'm going to roast it the same way, but not realizing that there's a density difference. They're just thinking it's novel, it's interesting, I'll try it, but they feel totally frustrated by it. And does that happen a lot?
I think this speaks to a wider issue if we want to expand the conversation beyond strictly density, because I think that it speaks to misconceptions about coffees based on nothing other than origin. And I know as a roaster, I've often been guilty of, saying, okay, this is a Guatemalan coffee from Huehuetenango. I know how to roast this. But the fact of the matter is, you've got so many other factors that play into what that coffee is comprised of. And, maybe it's processing, maybe it is elevation, maybe it's plant type. There are storage and handling issues potentially. And then choices the farmer has made about, the way that they care for their trees. And that brings me to a point about the human element in all of this, because I don't think we can or should be escaping the idea that each of these physical metrics in green coffee, each of the elements of trading green coffee, each of the elements of processing it are directly correlated to human hands in the supply chain, right? And acknowledging that is the first step towards embracing the necessary human element that is, I think, specialty coffee. And it's really what we're founded on,
Yeah, so it's easy in green buying, I imagine, in just handling a raw product like that to divorce it from that root, that human root. Practically speaking, when you're talking about somebody who might not take into account that element of the story behind the coffee and the hands that went to prepare it, is there some kind of a telltale sign in the way that people handle the physical product that is, and this is obviously experiential, but would say, yeah, it doesn't seem like the way that you're handling this green or purchasing it really seems like you're embracing that particular aspect of specialty, and it could translate into a worse coffee because maybe you're not as invested into making it great, you're just being too assumptive about it. in the purchasing, so you're assumptive about it in the roasting.
Yeah. You see the commoditization of so many things in the current culture and climate, and coffee is not immune to that, right? And I do think that from a roaster's perspective, the first thing that often happens is scaling up, and it's very easy when you begin to increase your volumes to decrease your quality control. Instead of sampling every roast, you're sampling every third roast of the same coffee, or you start looking for easy targets to hit, like time and temperature, without actually focusing on how you get there, right?
Okay.
So I think that those are a couple of cues that you might use as an industry insider, but I think that ultimately what it mostly, the most revelatory way that we see this is in communication, the way people talk to each other, and whether it's over an email or over the phone, commoditizing the conversations around coffee, eliminating the human element is it's rampant, right? And I think that one of the things that I try to address in the book is giving honest but sympathetic feedback, being good to each other in our conversations that sometimes are hard to have, when quality expectations maybe aren't met, or trade relationship isn't going to work out this season or whatever, is reminding ourselves of that human element in the coffee chain.
Yeah, it's interesting because, we have this mentality that says, I want to learn green coffee. I want to learn coffee. And in that statement, there is an idea that I will be done at some point. Once I read Chris Kornman's book,
no,
I will learn green coffee. And I think there's a distinction between, it seems like it, and I would like you to speak to this, the difference between learning and understanding. Or because understanding seems more relational. It seems like you're leaving room for development, to use a roasting term, I guess.
Sure.
How do you interpret the difference between understanding and just like getting knowledge?
That's such a good way to phrase it. I like to think of myself as a student still of green coffee, a student of life in many ways, and I would never believe that I'm done learning, or that by reading a piece of work, whether it's mine or by some professor who studied this for a long time, is going to give you the final period in the final sentence. And I think that speaks to a necessary element in, whether you call it learning or understanding of experience, because you can stick your nose into my book or any others for as long as you want, but until you're actually doing it, there's not that connection between the brain and the hands and the heart, right? And I think that when you do it with others, when you do it in the company of trusted colleagues or friends, or whether it's a mentor or just someone who's there with you, that it multiplies. It's like exponential, the way that learning happens when you do it with others.
Because they can call you on your BS.
Yeah, that's one way, absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, as a new, when you first got into green coffee and you were developing your understanding of it, and you were learning it, did you fall into that category of people at some points where you just wanted to sort of have a formula attached to it, and like, I want to learn this and I'll be done learning it, and I just want to be successful in my job? Because I feel like there's a pressure between, this is my job. I want to do well. I want to keep my job, and I have to perform and I have to deliver. But I also want to have this nice esoteric kind of like this ideal of a lifelong learner. I don't know if I could say what's right or wrong, but I still have to make a decision today. So how did you navigate sort of being open to being flexible while at the same time being under pressure as a new green buyer?
Yeah, that's tough. My first couple of years sourcing, I was traveling to Brazil and buying a large amount of coffee, on the order of close to 1 million pounds. And when you're doing that and you're new, you look to these contracts that were drawn in the past and the way relationships work and your trusted trade partners from previous cycles. And I think that I was, again, so lucky to have Kyle Glanville, who was the previous sourcing director. He's now at G&B and Go Get 'Em in LA.
Yeah.
He was directing Espresso for Intelligentsia at the time, and what he did, he organized my first trip, and instead of exclusively taking me to places where he'd been purchasing coffee before, he sent me up to the state of Bahia in Pietà, which had just recently won a bunch of Cup of Excellence competitions, and was like, hey, listen to what these folks are doing and have to say, and see if you can find new and innovative ways to bring in coffees from Brazil that Americans have never seen before. And that was like a crazy jump start for me. It was a wild trip, and I think that coming out of that and developing a green coffee QC program for Intelligentsia at that time, which did focus very specifically on formulas and metrics, I got locked into a system after a couple of years of trying to be innovative in sourcing. And it related more to feedback that I was giving to my suppliers, right, to growers and producers. And this is why I really want to focus on that human element again, because moving to California and joining the team at Royal, I started working with coffees that I'd never seen before at Intelli. And for example, maybe the glaring example would be like wet-hulled Sumatras, which break basically every rule in the book when it comes to someone like me who cut my teeth on washed coffees.
Right.
And embracing those idiosyncrasies of coffees grown and processed in Indonesia, because that is what makes them what they are. And, I think that there's been a lot of mediocre Mandelian coffee out on the market for a number of years, but when you actually focus on people who are doing good work, the people, and then you find those coffees that are unique. They've been processed in the same way as the generic bulk stuff. It's just that someone was actually careful with the details and paid attention to it all. And that's when I think that you start to find innovation. It gets back to that idea of relationships again, right? Where you have someone else that's alongside you that's doing it, or someone else that's involved in the process. So it's more than just yourself that you're relying on, right? It has to be.
You're bringing up something that is obviously in the air here at SCA, with the definition of specialty coffee being a wider one, and the celebration of more points of origin and styles that represent place and things like that, right? You bring up the mediocre Sumatran coffee, yet you and I both know that customers love a dark roast Sumatra. They love, I forget the name of the blend at Intelligentsia, the dark roast one.
There have been historically a couple, but the most famous one is probably El Diablo.
El Diablo. And I know that as a professional, I, as a pendulum swing, felt I was too good for things that were... But now I will buy coffees that are dark because I've gotten over myself a little bit, in a sense. Like, maybe the industry has helped me calm out on my own BS, right? So the customers have always loved it. Yeah. So are we just, like, as professionals assessing the qualities of coffees, are we kind of behind consumers? Are they ahead of us?
Wow. I mean, it's not a race.
Well, they're educating us in a sense. Like, they're saying, we've always liked this, and now you're embracing it. It's cool. It's cool to do.
It's absolutely true. I think it's one of the things that you have to understand about brand identity, and whether it's something that you've been locked into as an organization for a long time, or whether you're starting something new. You got to listen to those people that are going to be your customers and clients. And I do think that there was a time, and probably many people still fall into this, and I know that I definitely did during some of my time in the QC lab at Intelligentsia, was like, we're going to tell you what's good, right? And because we know, because I've been doing this for X number of years. And, who is it? Umeko that says cupping notes are opinions, right? And
yeah,
I think that... it's true. There are trainable, identifiable defects in coffee, but then there's a real wide spectrum of what we love and what we hate, and those are like my opinion, man. And I think that where was this going? What was the question? Have I answered it?
Well,
I don't think so.
I think we're just addressing the idea that when you're looking at green coffee as a representative of what consumers will purchase, There's a wider variety that we have to embrace because that's what they've been demanding, and we're starting to embrace it ourselves.
Yeah.
More blends, more varying origins of different varieties of flavors that you mentioned the renaissance of naturals.
Yeah.
There's some, this is very personally speaking, there's some pretty offensive naturals out there. I mean, there's offensive coffees, but the experimentation and the embracing is not going to be perfect, right? So the question is maybe how much experimentation does a green buyer make? How far do you push the envelope while also embracing what customers want?
Yeah. Well, it starts with equity. You got to be equitable in the way that you converse with your producing partners. If you're demanding an anaerobic coffee and that's something that your producing partner has never done before or has limited experience in, there's going to be an investment in equipment, there's going to be an investment in technique and learning, and there's likely going to be an investment in the coffee itself, which may or may not come out the way you want it. And for that to be exclusively weighing on the shoulders of the farmer or the processor is unfair, it's unequitable, and that's why I encourage roasters and buyers when they engage in those conversations to do it equitably, to put money where their mouth is, because otherwise, sorry about knocking the stand. I feel passionately about this.
Shaking things up here.
It's really, really critical to actually moving experimentation forward in directions that are sustainable. And if you look at the way that we engage with customers as roasters, the same is very much true. It's like you can roast dark and not care about it because people are going to buy it regardless of how much care you put into it. But when you do things like roast or blend with intentionality, when you're making a dark roast that shows off your skill as a roaster to get there, and that shows off the character of the coffee that you selected for that roasting style because you chose it with intentionality. Those are the things that meet customers where they need to be met. And as a roaster, it's like what you also want to be doing, right?
Yeah, well, the intentionality you're talking about is the intention to listen and care for the needs of both sets of customers, which would be the farmer is a customer and the customer on the consuming side, and meet in the middle somehow between the two of them, because you can't really... I feel like there's a lot of people's shelves that are full of experimental coffees that they know are really popular now, and they want to have them because you should have them, but customers are still buying the flagship blend, and it's frustrating to them.
Yeah.
And so the question is that, how do we... At what point does a roaster say, okay, maybe, we should not be experimenting with coffees. Maybe we should just be bringing in the standard green coffee to satisfy our customers, because these are just not selling and people just don't want these. We want them, but they don't want them.
Yeah, this is difficult because I do think that experimentation is necessary to drive us forward. I don't think that we'd be where we are right now with innovations in processing, and maybe some of them are gross, but also some of them are excellent and will sustain into the future. And you don't do that by just resting on your laurels and buying the same standard green coffee, right?
Okay, yeah.
So I think that it's absolutely necessary. The other side of that coin, I had a conversation recently with the roaster for Never Coffee Lab in Portland, Oregon, they're mostly doing blends, and it's we talked about how as an industry, it's so common for us to kind of signal to each other. Like these things like elevation and plant type, what do those actually mean to a person who's brewing their coffee at home that's not part of our industry? And I think the answer is probably not very much, right?
Yeah.
And so, Never's coffees are kind of marketed and blended in such a way as to highlight flavor and intentionality in that process.
Right.
And by focusing on what the consumers have been asking for, which is like coffee that tastes like this. Coffee sometimes that just tastes like coffee.
I love it. Yeah.
And they can do that and still be responsible in their sourcing and roasting practices, which I think is really, really beautiful.
How dare they not signal? They have not genuflexed before entering the Church of Specialty. I'm sorry. And they cannot enter. No, but okay, so when I'm looking at somebody who wants to get into green buying or just understand green coffee more, it's usually, I think, again, back to the beginning of this, there's a lot of new people getting into green coffee. What are some good signs that you're getting into green coffee for the right reason and the wrong reason?
That's a tough question.
Yeah, the illusions. What are the illusions that people should just dispense with when they're getting into green coffee? Are there certain precious ideals that they're just going to have to put on the back burner until they work their way into a certain understanding that's, like, you reach stasis, now you can innovate, now you can do those things. You know, like a barista wants to pour swans right out of the gate, but they have to learn how to pull a shot of espresso first. Like, what's that trajectory for green?
Okay, that's a good way to frame it, because it's easy to get into green coffee purchasing for the right reasons and just not know what you're actually getting yourself into. And part of what you're getting into is signing contracts and understanding trade terms. And so, like, the idea that you're able to communicate your expectations and that you're able to understand a few basic, really easy to understand terms about, like, who gets paid when and where, and what the coffee's value is. Having those conversations is universal, whether you're engaged in direct trade or buying spot coffee from a warehouse, in Oakland, California. I think that there's one other element of this, and I think it's the travel thing, where there's definitely a romanticization of traveling, and I think that it's easy to kind of view that as some sort of...
Yeah, you're like an Indiana Jones of coffee or something. Everyone wants to be Jeff Watts.
I love Jeff.
Yes.
And he was a mentor for me for many years.
Oh, yeah.
And the coffee cowboy thing. I think that worse than that sometimes is the idea that you're trying to uplift a bunch of people, and what that just does is other them. It becomes you versus them, or you,
right.
Or them, and it's us. It's a relationship. It's all we in this together, a rising tide raising the ships. We lift each other up, and that's the way that I want to engage with people in the industry, whether it's a roaster friend or a grower friend.
Yeah.
And I think that travel was a big part of my learning experience in coffee, and finding that there is a lot of excitement and adventure to it, but also the reason you're doing it is to develop relationships, right? And I think that if you lose sight of that, I feel like I've been harping on this a lot, but that's the core of what we're trying to do.
I can imagine somebody going on a trip and making decisions with a mindset of that romanticized idea of where they are, and like they're not really using a lot of reason. They're not sober-minded in the way that they're handling the trip, so they're not sober-minded in the decisions that they're making. So, getting rid of that romantic ideal while also enjoy yourself, yeah, sure, but at the same time, do it soberly with the urgency of knowing that the trip is also for the purpose of something greater than just enjoyment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the Le Nez du Café kit that folks use for sensory training has this element of, in the art and science of evaluating a coffee's aroma, there's a step that they call appreciation. And don't ever, of course the French, but don't ever lose sight of the fact that I love what I do.
Yes.
All that being said, it's really easy to fall into a trap when you're on a sourcing trip that you have the money, so you are the person that's in a position of power in a relationship with growers who want to sell their coffee to you, right? And when that imbalance shows up in conversations and in engagements, it creates inequity. And so, what you have to do is enter it with eyes wide open, understanding your place as a person who is visiting someone else's farm, someone else's country. It's their home, right? This is where they live and grow and work and eat and raise families. And the humility that has to come with that necessarily, the respect that you have for a person, and their space, I think goes a long way to shaping that relationship in the right direction. And I guess what I mean by that, strictly speaking, is listening a lot more than you talk, asking questions to understand, not to posture. And, when you take photographs, get consent.
Oh, yeah. Good. That's a good note, too. That's a big thing, because people use the image, the romanticized idea of these are the hands, but they're just floating hands. They're detached. They're not attached to anybody. They're just on bags,
Right.
Reaching a point of saturating yourself with this mentality of understanding. So understanding green coffee seems synonymous with understanding the people that make green coffee possible.
Absolutely. They're
Right.
inextricably tied.
Yes. And so my last question to you, I guess, is looking at how the industry is now and where it's going, how should somebody that is in a position of power in green coffee order their next steps in their roastery? What are the things they need to keep in the forefront of their mind, maybe practically speaking for the business? We talked about density as one of those things that we really need to be aware of, right? But beyond that, what other things should people really keep as priorities so that they can do a good job and do good while doing that job?
It's a great question. And I think the first answer that comes to mind, and maybe the most relevant, is communication. I think that it's easy to kind of forget about that. And I don't just mean communication to, we've been talking a lot about producers and green coffee sellers and buyers, and that requires an immense amount of effort on communicating clearly, but also like communicating with your staff, the people that are surrounding you, whether you have a team of roasters or quality control professionals, engaging with them, speaking to the baristas who are handling that product on a daily basis, and asking questions of curiosity and interest about how they work with those beans. It goes all directions, right? The communication.
Communication is always relevant. It's a good word. Thank you. Chris Kornman, author of Green Coffee, and you can find that on roastmagazine.com. And is there a website for the book as well?
Yeah, roastmagazine.com/greencoffee.
/greencoffee.
Yeah.
Okay, go buy yourself a copy.
Hey,
thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much. This has been fun.
Well, I hope that this conversation was helpful for you all. Chris is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom. He's gained over his long career in coffee, and so I'm really excited to have gotten the chance to sit down with him. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time and insights. And if you want to learn more about green coffee, it's all in this handy book that Chris has written called Green Coffee, a guide for roasters and buyers. You can find that over at roastmagazine.com/greencoffee. And beyond that, if you're in Oakland, you should definitely visit Chris's place of work, where he is the Director of Education, which is the Crown Royal Coffee Lab and Tasting Room in Oakland, California. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about this episode or any other episode of Keys to the Shop, feel free to send me an email, chris@keystotheshop.com. And with that, that is the end of our episode today. Thank you, everybody, again for joining me on this 6th installment of the Rate of Rise Live series. Don't forget to subscribe to Roast Magazine. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.